Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. My name is HarveyBracken-Smith, and today I'm honored to be joined by Dr. John Harpham. Dr. John is the author of The Intellectual Origins of American Slavery, which has actually been nominated for the History Pulitzer Prize. He's got a PhD from Harvard and an undergrad at Duke University, which is also my great university. He's worked at Middlebury, UChicago, Harvard University, is now at the University of Oklahoma. I'm incredibly excited to speak to you today, John. I wanted to get started by asking you, why do you love books and why get into academia?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for getting in touch. Thank you for your interest and attention. And Harvey, I very much look forward to the conversation. Interest in books. It dates from an early age. My mom is a teacher and a poet, and my father was an English professor when I was growing up. He became an academic administrator and a public intellectual over time. And so books were in the family from an early age. My parents both read to me at night when I was a kid before going to bed. I still remember all those hours and all the books that we read. And, so I love books from an early age. And then I came to write one.
And what led from that transition from just having an interest in literature and academia to wanting to pursue it as a career? Because I think that many people that go to Ivy League schools or places like Duke University have a general broad interest in, wanting to become their best selves and wanting to push themselves. But to actually pursue it as a career and go and write a book as you have is a much more focused path than most of your peers would have done.
I'm glad you asked that question. It is such a different thing to go from being a student to being a scholar, from being a consumer of knowledge to being a producer of knowledge. And from the time I started in college, and from before, in fact, probably from when I was 15, I knew that I wanted to be a scholar and a writer. And in part, that was because that example was in front of me every day in the form of my father and my father's friends and our family friends. I more or less grew up in the Tulane English department, where my dad was a professor, and then was raised in the National Humanities Center, which is an institute for advanced study, where he was the director from when I was 15. And so I was around scholars all the time. I saw what kind of life that was. I saw the kind of not just the intelligence or the ideas, but the kind of habits, the personality, the temperament, the rhythm that it took to be a scholar. And so by the time I started in college, that was more or less what I knew I wanted to do. There was maybe a 2-week period in my senior year when I thought I wanted to go to law school. And, the people who knew me then and who were my mentors said, that's a mistake. That's not who you are. And so always I approached my classes and the whole academic experience in college from a little bit different perspective from my, that of my fellow students and my friends. It was a preparation to be a scholar, not just a test of how I would be a student.
Interestingly, I think in the modern era with the likes of social media, I mean, when I was a kid and I'd read books, perhaps as someone I would argue more motivated than a lot of people, I would want to, perhaps I'll become an author, perhaps I'll write my own book. But I think for most people, writing a book and pushing themselves in that direction was never really a thought, like in terms of being a producer of knowledge. But I would argue in the age of social media, it's become much more apparent because sure, you might have kids who read books all day, but with social media, with these amygdala driven responses, people are spending all day online. And so there's much more of this transition of people wanting to be a producer of knowledge. What do you think was the key thing in terms of you wanting to add and to produce knowledge yourself in terms of just, there's so much knowledge out there from so many great people. Why do you think you wanted to add your name to that list? And how do you decide upon slavery to be your means of doing so?
Great. And um, we can get to the content of the book. We can get to the discussion history of slavery a little bit later, because there's so much to say just about these kind of foundational questions that you raise about moving from a producer to a consumer of knowledge. Yeah, when I was in college, we didn't have social media. Uh, we did have running water and heat and other features of modern life, but it was a fair amount of time ago. And so the divide between us as students and our professors was profound. Certainly, when I went to graduate school, I was a student in the government department at Harvard. Very hierarchical place. And it was, the systems in which I was educated were ones in which it was assumed that you would have to put in a long time and a lot of effort to earn the right to be read, as opposed to just keep reading, to earn the right to become a scholar. And so that leap across the divide from student to scholar, from someone who reads books to someone who writes books, was the drama of and the difficulty of graduate school, I think, for everyone of, who was in my generation. It was like a daunting task. And many of us, I know I experienced them for years. I didn't know that I would be able to do it. I didn't know that I would be able to write this book or to finish this book until it finally was done, because it was just seen as the most difficult thing we'd ever done. And it was hard to imagine how to do it before you did it.
In terms of the actual book itself, which I'd love to go into a little more detail on it, how do you actually go about producing knowledge? How do you find new knowledge? How do you find verified sources? Because, if you were to ask me, I think most people would look more to, large language models or Google to find knowledge. Was it a case of having to, go through libraries, talk to people? Could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yes. It was a long process. And it was not a straightforward process in my case. I started working on my dissertation. My book started life as a dissertation at Harvard. And when I first started to frame the idea of what I would want to do for a PhD, it was 19th century American intellectual history. I wanted to tell the story of the debates over slavery in the antebellum period, in the 30 years or so leading up to the American Civil War. 1830 to 1860 was my major period. And I went about finding out those texts. They're not too hard to find. Almost all of the material that I needed was printed. It was in libraries. You could just pick the books off the shelves. And I was going to end my book with a joint discussion of two of the central figures of American political life and political thought, in Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And so I started to do the research on that book, on that version of what my dissertation would be. And I was just in libraries, regular old libraries. And there were good things that you could read online as well. But at a certain point, I was introduced to the rare book library, and the many rare book libraries in Cambridge. And I kind of just got lost in them. And I couldn't stop reading. And always I would read backward in time. So I would read the 19th century works, and then the 18th century works, and then the 17th century, and then the 16th century. And yeah, my book now runs from 1550 to 1700. And yes, you have to kind of conduct a large language model of your own to read as much as you possibly can. But for the most part, the works that I was reading, a lot of them hadn't been digitized. Even the ones that had been digitized, they were much easier to read and understand in the physical form of the book than online. And so it was actually crucial for me, in order to get as much information as possible, to be in rare book rooms with books themselves rather than online.
There's a question I have, which is probably, a harsher question than most, but something that's going to come to mind. Being I'm a white person from the UK. I've lived in the US for a couple of years now, and some of my best friends are black. And this idea of slavery is something which I would relate to from the past, but I wouldn't really say that in terms of my cultural roots and even how that informs the person I am today with reference to the past. It's not really something I think about on a day to day. But I was speaking to one of my best friends a month or so ago about it, and he was saying that even though slavery has ended, it still informs the people that they are today, and they still have a knowledge of what that was like. So I want to ask you that question, like how you feel or how you deal with the critics who might say this wasn't an experience that your people had to face. So how do you go about telling those stories in the best way possible without having that related experience?
And of course, that's correct. Of course, that's correct. And we will all relate to the history of slavery, or to the history that I tell in my book, differently. And I tell it from a certain perspective. I tell it from the perspective of a scholar. I also tell it from the perspective of a white man born and raised in America in the 20th century and living in the 21st century. And I to go through my position as an author and what I think it brings to the table, how I think we should think about that in the prologue to the book. So I confront it head on because I think it's a question that not only every reader of my work has, but everyone in my life with whom I talk about my work has had. That's the first question they have when they learn that I work on the history of slavery. They say, "What brought you to this topic? What interested in you in this? Why do you think this was important? What did you think you could contribute to this field?" And so that's the the response to that question, I think, is very important in a work like this. And so I go through it at the start of the book, and it frames the entire thing. In other words, I don't think, and this is to get to your point, I don't think the history of slavery, or a work in the history of slavery, can be told from the kind of can be told effectively from the dry academic perspective that you might apply to a book about Hobbes or Locke. I think the history of slavery continues to shape the world in which we live. And so every attempt to reckon with the history of slavery needs to start with, that fact. But there's more to be said here, I think. The UK approach, and I think British people approach this topic differently from American people. And that's, the variety of reasons for that. But I've noticed that difference very strongly, not just among scholars, but also in the popular press. And within America, I'm from a very specific place, which is I'm from New Orleans, and which was the center of the antebellum domestic slave trade, which was, one of the crucial centers of the Confederacy, and which is a place where, more than most places in America, the past is present. And if you grow up in New Orleans, you cannot avoid the clear recognition that you live in a world that, in part, slavery made. That the history of slavery is not past, and it's not distant. It's present, and it's present right there. And so when it came time for me to think about what I would make my contribution to, so we talked about, what it means to write a book, what it means to move from a consumer to a producer of knowledge. When it came down to think about what I would work on, what would define my career, it became clear to me that this centrally important theme in American history and American life, history of slavery, had not been adequately addressed or understood in the field that was my own, in the academic field that was my own, which is intellectual history, political theory, and the history of political thought, which for the most part had been told as a story most focused on the history of freedom, the development of modern ideas of freedom, their ancient and medieval and Renaissance precedents, and then the implications of our kind of shared concepts of freedom for contemporary institutions in American life. And it seemed to me that given what I had, given where I was from, what I thought I knew about America and the centrality of slavery in American history, that had not been adequately addressed in the field that I had started to write in. I thought I would turn the tools of that field to the study of this important topic.
Thank you for your eloquent way of, dissecting that. I think and I'm not trying to oversimplify this topic, but I would argue that there's two main ways with reference to talk about slavery as a topic. One is that you accept what happened in the past, and you can have any feeling that you want around that, but hopefully you decide, this is what happened, how can we move forward and ensure this doesn't happen again? Or there's the other way in which you choose for erasure of the past, you ignore it and you simply move on. The reason I mentioned that is I remember in the COVID pandemic, not just with reference to slavery, but in terms of many of the leaders from Great Britain, many of the statues throughout the country were toppled down because people believe that it's better to erase the past than it is to, say this is what happened in the past and move forward. I'd love to get your perspective on, as someone that's not an academic, and for the listeners of this podcast, that want to both, on the one hand, remember the past, be able to relate to those whose families have experienced it, and be able to be better moving forward. But also maybe people don't want to look back at the past because it was so horrible, if awful mistakes were made, and want to move forward. I'd want to get your perspective on how the average person listening to this podcast should think about those two contradicting ideas, and to be as respectful as possible, but also as informed as possible to make the best decisions in their own lives.
Great. And that's a very well put question. And I think it's a serious question. On the one hand, you have to know your past. You have to know your past. And there are, you mentioned earlier that I come to the history of slavery from a particular position as a white person, which is true, and it's important for the following reason. There are some white people in America and across the world who think that white people in the present shouldn't have to think about the history of slavery because it might make them feel bad, or it might make them feel like they were implicated in the wrongs of the past, or that it is just the past and it's so distant that we ought not to think about it. We ought not to have to reckon with it in the present. And I don't agree with that point of view. I think, as I said, that the history of slavery has shaped this country. It's shaped much of the Atlantic world. And in order to understand and live in our world, we have to reckon with and understand our past. But also for another reason, because for the most part, the story I tell in my book is a story of perhaps the greatest wrong in the history of the nation, and the people who committed it, and the people who justified it, and the people who accepted that it was legitimate, or argued against it in some ways, but not in others, or the people who practiced it never thought to write down an idea about it. And those people were people who would have thought of themselves as white. And I think in order to be a conscious and aware citizen in the present, we also have to be critical in our self-examination of ourselves. And we have to come to terms, we have to study and understand the terrible evils of the past, the people who committed them, that they are not, or perhaps you could put it the other way around, that we are not entirely different from them. we should reflect on ourselves, on what habits of mind we have in common with the authors of the evils of the past. And so the history of slavery is also one that would provoke us as white people to critical self-reflection on ourselves. Now, that didn't fully answer your question, but I can if you
Yeah,
would
I'd love
like
you
me to.
to, if that's all right.
Great. So, okay. First of all, here's a very important point that has to be made that I think has been lost in the debate about remembrance of slavery and monuments on slavery. So the history of slavery as a field, as a topic that people write about, as a topic that as a field that's taught in at least college education, has been a very important field since at least World War II, or at least since the 1950s or 1960s. And there are so many books written about the history of slavery. And there have been so many classes taught about the history of slavery. There are so many historians working today on the history of slavery. There are entire journals devoted to it. Many journals that are not explicitly devoted to it are devoted to the history of slavery. It is a thriving field. We are remembering our past. But there are different ways in which and that's a good thing, by the way. But there are different ways different modes in which we remember the past. From the historical point of view, we remember the past because that's what we do. That's our charge, and that is our role in society as scholars, to understand. But there is a difference between public commemoration and memorials and the mere memory of the past. Public commemoration memorials are for people you want to honor, not just in the past necessarily, but also in the present. And so I think there's a real difference between writing about the history of slavery from a scholarly point of view or even popular point of view, but basically just a historical point of view, and on the other hand, commemorating and honoring people from the past who were, centrally involved and implicated in the history of slavery. That is more of a nod to the present and of what we want to take from them in the past and apply to our present. I don't necessarily think we really want to take I don't think we want to really honor the historical practices of people who traded in slaves or held slaves. And I think that's probably an understatement.
Well, thank you for your breakdown. I think I agree with the not commemorating those that supported slavery, but also the understanding of it. And I think if you are to, I'm going to take back that statement. I think it's important to look back at the past, and I think there has to be measures taken in order to understand the past. I'm not as much of a fan of erasing, just because, on the good and the bad, depending on political beliefs, slavery is a much more extreme thing, I think. But I think there are more modern day issues, for example, that in 50 or 100 years' time, depending on if the political party is more left or more right, if erasure is something that we've enabled in our toolbox, I think that could be used moving forward. So I'd be much more of the side of increased understanding rather than erasure. But I do definitely see why someone may not want to see that on their doorstep, for example. Something that I think is particularly pressing issue, and yeah, all these topics on the podcast, and this podcast in particular, are very deep and pressing. So I appreciate you talking them through with me. But something over the last few years has been this idea of cancel culture, and I would go a step further than that. I would argue in America you have freedom of speech, but I would argue that as an extension of that, people have tried to enforce forced understanding, is what I would call it. And I would say forced understanding is the notion in which, when there is something so big and so pertinent and so important, that people feel that everyone should know it. But the problem is there are so many important topics, whether slavery, whether abortion, whether your First Amendment rights, whatever it is, that is so important that if you told everyone to understand everything straight away, we'd be, sitting in a library all day trying to understand things and wouldn't have the sort of freedom of expression and understanding. So, on that point, how do you balance important issues such as slavery and trying to educate the 350 million people in the US on it without forcing the issue down their throats and allowing for freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of understanding, but also education? How do you balance the two, and how does that intertwine with cancel culture or the erasure of it?
Another great question, and not easy to respond to. It's very complicated. Look, I'll say one thing before I proceed to the real answer. And the one thing is, while I was writing this book for the last 8 years, I taught in that period 40 college classes that had across them probably 700 students. And my students were my first audience. And they often read my work. And even if they didn't read my work, they listened to me working out some of the ideas that eventually made it into the book. And always I was in the classroom and working with students, talking in office hours, mentoring them. Probably some of my former students will listen to this podcast along the way, and thinking about how to speak to students, who, today's young people, about the crucial issues. And I didn't just teach about the history of slavery and freedom and race, but those are major themes of the classes I teach. And I think that experience, by the way, or that form of experience of having to be in the classroom next to people, talking with them in long-term relationships of education and mentorship, is really productive. And it's probably the only way to work out issues as profound and personal and important as these ones are, and which opinions differ so much. So my kind of approach to these issues is not just that of a scholar. It's also someone who's been constantly in the classroom for the last 8 years. Now, to get a little bit closer to your question, it's a very historical question, or historicizing question that you ask. You say, like, look, in recent years, the politics of history seems to have changed. The way we think about our history seems to have changed. And I think that's absolutely true. When I started writing this book, it was 2015. Started writing it in 2015 and finished it, and it's coming out in 2025. And during that time, I think it's fair to say that the history of slavery has become more present in our contemporary culture. I think Americans and British people, a lot of people are more aware of the history of slavery and that it is important to understand it and curious about, knowing more. That said, the specific politics of the history of slavery has changed dramatically several times. And if you study a topic that has contemporary relevance over a long period of time, you'll always notice this. The way we think about these issues has changed. And it changed from maybe 2015 to 2020. It changed again in 2020. It's probably changed again in the past couple of years. And you know what? I can guarantee you it's going to change again. The way we think about the remembrance of our, collective past is going to change again. So always my aim was to write a book that wouldn't necessarily come with a timestamp. That when you read it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 30 years from now, you wouldn't necessarily know that it was written when it was written. It would still speak to you in general enough terms, in human enough terms. The tone of it would still stand up, even when the specific politics of the issues have all changed, which they will. I think that's my That's at least my first cut at an answer to your question. How do you find that?
Oh, it was great. Thank you. I want to ask kind of one more overlapping question, but kind of linking more into the content of your book. So we'll link into that. So I used to be an economics major, and then I switched at the start of this year to sociology. And one of the interesting things I learned about was race. And the reason I say that's interesting is I think it's pretty obvious that, a lot of us have different skin colors, white, black, brown, whatever it may be, or different variations of it. But what I hadn't thought as much about was the labels of race. Because, as over time, as more races have blended and we become a more multicultural and globalized world, different people have moved all over the place. My best friend from the UK is half Chinese, half English. So is he one or the other or both? How does that work, particularly as we evolve over time? But something I found really fascinating was this idea of black or idea of white for different countries, although people's skin colors might look the same or different, how they were classed as different races was completely different. Like in India, for example, they had the caste system, where it was more focused on your position in society was linked to your race rather than just the color of your skin. The reason I say that, now linking more into your book and into slavery, and please correct me if I'm wrong, um, but I believe that slavery started out as people would go and conquer lands, and then they would go and get the people that they got from those lands, and instead of killing them, they'd see it as a better way is to keep them as a slave and to put them as to work, to killing them. But over time, over time, this transitioned into slavery being used as a more common thing, and then particularly in America, even, and I'll let you go into more detail on this, even the free man could be turned into a slave. I want to, the crux of my question is, how did we get to a point where we saw other human beings, other flesh and blood, as less than us? What was the moral justification for saying that this human being is not as human as I am? Could you take me on that story from the origins of slavery up to that moral justification?
It's a long story. Um,
Or the shortened
before,
version of it, the shortened version of it. We'll have to read the book if.
not a problem. But before I answer that question, I actually wanted to come back and circle around to your previous question. Just one final time. Because you asked a question about, and you made a point earlier, I think, that was very good, about your hesitation to accept a politics of erasure, about the erasure of the past. And even as you certainly acknowledged and accepted that there's a difference between historical memory and analysis and the honoring of figures from the past, you also expressed discomfort with a view of the past that would have us erase it in favor of our own contemporary politics. In part because, as you said, the targets of our erasure, the 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 things we would like to erase will change in the future. And if we establish as a precedent that we're willing to erase, parts of our heritage or history that we don't like, those parts will, that politics will maybe come for a part of the world that we wouldn't want it to come for in the future. And I wanted to make a point based on that, I think, very fair analysis, which is that our moral attention is always selective, and it always changes. Because the moral universe, or rather considered from a moral point of view, the universe is very complex. There are a lot of different things about the world that we could consider morally. And what we choose to devote our moral attention and energy to is a process of selection determined by cultural, political, economic, religious factors. And it changes. And it is such a common thing in human history. And every historian of the anti-slavery movement is very much attuned to this fact. To see moments in history when people's moral attention shifts from what it was to something else, or it shifts in the matter of degree. Something that had been known to be wrong now came to be seen as the most wrong thing. And in a sense, that's the story of the origins of the anti-slavery movement. It is brought about by a shift in moral attention. And shifts in moral attention are always happening, and they always will happen. If you study the history of morals, what you see is that it's a history of change, not continuity. Now, in reference to your question about race, the origins of race, and how it came to be the case, or how it could be the case, that we would see another person as lesser than us, I would actually flip around the question, Harvey. I think one of the more unusual, or like one of the more recent phenomena in human history is the impulse to see all of us as equal and as equally part of the human community, demanding and entitled to certain rights and protections. However, the way in which we frame and understand the differences between human beings has changed, dramatically over time. And, there are basically two main accounts, two common accounts of the origins of American slavery in my field. And they work between your two different majors, actually, or they're based on your two different majors. So the first is a purely economic account that says, what were the origins of American slavery? Well, they came in, they had to do with calculations of supply and demand at a certain period of time, where it became more profitable for English merchants and colonists and their investors and supporters to turn to enslaved labor than to free servant labor. And in that economic account, race follows from fundamental economic facts. Race figures as the creation of, the ideology of, the tremendously unequal and racially stratified system that those economic incentives pointed to and helped to create. So in that view of things, race still is important, but it's like a gloss on, it's a retrospective justification of prior economic arrangements. And if you wanted to answer your question, how did people come to see others as less than? It's when it became profitable for them to do so. So that's the one common account. The other common account is the opposite of that one. It actually treats race and racism, anti-black white racism in particular, as the founding fact in the Atlantic world. And racism on this account was present from the start. It was present from the earliest encounters between Englishmen and Africans. And it so happened that in the encounters between those two broad groups of people, some of the fairest skinned people in the world, the English, came into contact with some of the darkest skinned people in the world, on the western coast of Africa. And from the earliest moments of this encounter, an aversion started to take place, started to become evident. The English saw themselves as fundamentally different from and better than the peoples of Africa whom they met. And many consequences followed from this on this account. Empire, exploitation, subjugation, and slavery was one of those. And on that account, race is not only precedes slavery, but also obviously follows the end of slavery as well. But the basic story is a story of race. Slavery is just an episode on that account. So my book, so these are two very common interpretations, and they've both been around since about the 60s. And my book presents a new account. It works between those two different accounts. It accepts some features of them and denies some other ones. But to put it most simply, it tries to produce a more subtle narrative of the origins of American slavery than both of those. Both of those accounts are essentially monocausal, totalizing accounts. And I wanted to produce a subtler, more complex one that focused actually on contingent conjunctures and changes over time.
You mentioned, and of course this question is a stretch and not my own belief, but I feel like I'd be stupid not to ask the question. You mentioned before, and I agreed upon the notion that there are certain morals that over time will change. You know, with regard to us arguing that slavery is wrong to now it is the worst thing on the planet, and how that will evolve over time, just as is any other moral issue. So that feeds more to the point of moral relativism, in which morals differ from, countries and cultures, versus more moral absolutism. Do you think that slavery is wrong? What's your justification of it? And do you think we can say in all circumstances that slavery is wrong? And how do you justify that?
Here's how I would put it. On the one hand, you're not wrong that I drew attention earlier to the history of morals as a history of constant change. And if you study, the more you study the history of morals, the more you write about the history of morals and follow the, in the middle of your own contemporary moment, the more you realize that things have changed, are changing, and will change. At the same time, the way in which morals works, the way in which moral beliefs become real, become the bedrock for our societies, is if you believe that they are not subject to change or just the whim of the moment. The way that morals take hold in a society, shape a society, is if the people who believe those morals believe them, truly, believe them as fundamental facts about the universe. So I'll bring this together in an answer to your question. Over the course of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, so the modern history of the Western world, it became perhaps the most bedrock belief that we held that all people were by nature free. All people were by nature free, and that our natural freedom set a standard set a limit upon the consequences of human action, by which I mean that no person could ever become a slave. The natural freedom of all humankind meant that all people always had to be free as opposed to enslaved. So that slavery was the very violation of the most basic belief that we held. That seems to me to be the most responsible way in which you could state the matter without giving a kind of abstract answer to the question of slavery is wrong. We believe that slavery is wrong, and that belief is the basis for our political and moral philosophies.
I want to extend from that question because just to, I'm not trying to be a harsh interview. I agree with you that slavery is wrong on all accounts, but I think it's an interesting thing to critically think about it because as morals change over time, how do you hold dear to the morals and values that matter the most on the belief that some crazy leader or some dictator or whatever could go about and changing everything and therefore also change the hearts and the minds of the people? On that point, both on the left and the right in the US at the moment, there's this big thing about what they call fake news. And this has kind of been accelerated by AI, in which we don't know whether stuff really happened or was AI, was it AI? This was shown in the Ukraine-Russia war, as many explosions and deaths were shown, and you couldn't tell if it was from the war itself or from wars from decades earlier. So on that point, another more pressing question, do you think it's more important to have morals that are right, such as, slavery should not exist and, will not exist in the future, but that the people that believe in those things do not critically understand them? Or do you think it's better that people understand morals for themselves and build up their own area of knowledge, but that leaves the risk that people get it wrong and that just as slavery happened in the past, that it could happen again in the future? How do you balance those two ideas?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Well, I'll put it this way. I think the most important thing in the present, a very uncertain time, time when technology is rapidly changing, is not simply that we hold and enforce certain foundational beliefs, whether or not people really believe them or reflect upon them or think about them, or hold them as their own rather than as beliefs that are given to them and that they must hold. It is important as well that we inculcate in our citizenry, in our young people, the ability to form beliefs for themselves and to develop the habits of mind that will allow us not just to say what we're supposed to say or believe in the moment what we're supposed to believe, but that we have the rational faculty to form beliefs, to respond to new conditions, and to be resilient in the face of the challenges that will obviously, face us. One consequence of the fact that the obvious fact that morals change over time is that morals are a contested ground. The anti-slavery movement was not just an inevitable fact. It was a political and historical achievement of the 18th and 19th centuries, which is to say, it is not necessarily the case that we all hold the belief that slavery is wrong and should never be visited on anyone across the earth again. It is an achievement that always has to be recognized as an achievement, maintained, respected, inculcated for the future. So it is just as important that we can reason for ourselves as that we hold the right beliefs. Because in the future, as I said, at least to some extent, those beliefs will change, and we will need the ability to reason for ourselves to new ones that are beneficial as well.
Yeah, I think with topics like this, I think this is the kind of thing in which people say it's bad, so you can't do it on all accounts. I can't remember, so anyone listening, please do your own research. But I can't remember who said it, but it's almost like the people that are most horrified by the thing are more likely to do the thing. So you almost have to have the idea in your mind that we are all capable as human beings of doing bad things and of doing good things. And it's better to have that idea in your mind and to make decisions critically with the knowledge that you're capable of doing it rather than saying that you would never do it at all. Like good people can do bad things and bad people can do good things. So to know that slavery is something that has happened in the past, not to erase it and not to say this won't happen again, but say it won't happen again because of these reasons. We have moved past it. It's better to be equals in society. It's better to, respect, our own flesh and blood, but also the people, love thy neighbor, even going from a religious standpoint. And also the other point you said with regard to critical thinking, I would argue is the most important skill as a society that we have in the modern day. Even when I asked you the question with regard to fake news and understanding, we're at a very hard time because political leaders are using AI and using the lack of critical thinking for their own advantage, both on both the left and the right. And the problem with that is it leads to a society in which people don't think for themselves. And so at this singular point in time, it can get to a vote or something important, which enables you to get something, into law, which might be the good thing at the time. But it leads to a society of numbless brains. It leads to a society where people don't think for themselves. And, the people next to us, the voters on the street, the business owners, the employees, the workers, etc., these are people that you need critical thinking in. And, we don't want this numbness, mindless society. So I think that's going to be something very interesting that as the leaders of this world, with increased digitalization, social media, technology, AI, in which people have to think less themselves, there's going to have to be even more reform towards critical thinking to enable people to think for themselves, even if they are to disagree with you. Otherwise, our society will collapse and we'll only have a minority making the decisions because people won't be even capable of thinking.
And let's just be crystal clear about one, important piece of this. Because you're a college student, I teach college, I've taught college for a long time. This is what college is supposed to do. It is supposed to develop the critical rational faculty of citizens to live in a democracy, which means that we are capable of self-governing. And if you can, as you describe, kind of win in a small political conflict where you win some people to your side, but you kind of treat them as drones and not capable of reflection on their own. You might win once, but you will have degraded the capacity of the country. And one thing that I think, one consequence of the fact that I was teaching the entire time I was writing this book was that I was always dealing with the I was always attempting to teach young people to think for themselves about the most complex issues, that we have. I teach political theory. I teach American political thought. I teach basically the disciplines in which we teach people to think for themselves. And always what I wanted at the end of the semester, really at the end of any student's time in college, was for them to wonder what I thought and not know. To be interested in what I thought, to be interested in the way that I thought about things, but not ever to really know. For the reason that the whole purpose is for them to think for themselves and to come to a conclusion for themselves over time. Just to come back very briefly to the first part of your question, which I think was really profound. One thing I refused to do over the course of this book was to detach myself from the subjects of the book. The subjects of the book are authors of terrible moral evil. They're the people who are responsible for the origins of American slavery. But I thought it would be too easy, and I thought it would be incorrect to detach myself from them so completely as to see them as moral aliens, and to presume that I and people in the present were morally perfect. We know all the right answers. That the people in the past, they were evil people. They were not like us. I think more than we would want to believe, they were like us. They are not only the authors of The Origins of American Slavery. This book is about a period called the early modern period. That's the period of the book. This is the period in which the modern world in which we still live is shaped. Modern precepts of political freedom were developed in the early modern period. Early forms of capitalism and commercial society, nations, commercial connections. One of the first ages of great global connection was during this. This is a period that gave rise to our present in many ways, and also in the history of slavery. And so we should implicate ourselves in the past more than we do, not just in the parts of it that we would want to own, but also self-critically in the parts of it that we regard now as terrible moral evils.
In the, because we've got limited time left, I want to ask you a few short answer questions. They are still bigger topics, but I want to ask you short answer just so we can get through all the questions before we finish. The first of which is, what do you think is the biggest learning you've had from writing this book?
Well, as a professor, I'm professionally unable to provide short answers to questions. Okay, biggest learning. It's not about how smart you are. It's about determination, steadiness of belief, keeping a positive attitude. All those things you hear about as kind of self-help lessons, in the end, that's all you have. Nothing is more important. It's not about how smart you are.
What's the biggest learning that you've taken away from slavery in general, and how do you apply that to your life moving forward?
From studying the history of slavery? It's the one that we just talked about, that we are not so different. We are not as different from the people of the past as we would want to be, or than we sometimes assume we are. And as a result of that fact, we should examine the character of our own beliefs, and not just our beliefs, but our assumptions about the world more than we do.
What's the biggest misconception you think people have about you and the work that you do?
Well, I think, Harvey, at this point, I don't think anyone has any real conception about me or the work that I do. So far, I've just been, writing my work and, teaching my classes. I think the book seems poised to have more of a public profile in the weeks and months ahead. So we'll see what conceptions people develop about me. I don't know what they are now.
What can we do as people in the UK or the US where slavery is on a much smaller scale than it previously was a couple hundred years ago, in countries or in continents like in Asia and Africa where some forms of slavery still exist? What should we do as a society on account of your book and your own learnings and growing up in Louisiana? What should we do to go about ending modern day slavery?
Hmm. And there are many scholars in that field. And one of my great mentors, Orlando Patterson, who's the greatest living scholar of slavery, has written a book that just came out called Enslavement, Past and Present. I would recommend that you look into the scholars who are working in that field today. I think the only obvious answer to your question that I have is never to assume historical progress. Never to assume that historical progress will continue into the present and into the future. You ought not to be complacent.
How have you evolved as a person over the past 10 years writing this book?
I've lost some hair. Um, I have learned what it means to dedicate your life fully to a craft. I think when I started this book, I knew that I was really interested in this. This gets back to the start of our interview. I knew that I loved books. I knew I wanted to be a scholar. I didn't know what it meant to fully, completely, with every fiber of your being, dedicate yourself to a difficult project. I wanted to learn what that felt like, to take yourself to the absolute limits of what you could do and then push through them again and again. And I think I did that with this book. And I definitely didn't know what that was I didn't even know that that was really possible beforehand.
What was the feeling like of being nominated for the Pulitzer Prize?
Um, Kind of puzzlement. It's an academic book, and that's a public prize. Um, I think it was the feeling was really that the work that I had done was being seen, because you write for yourself. I don't write for anybody else. I write for myself, and you just tap away at those paragraphs and sentences, and puzzle over those commas and the footnotes for years and years, and you're never really sure if anyone will see or appreciate the artistry that hopefully went into that. And I guess that seemed to be an indication that the work that I had put in was was visible.
What kept you going?
Yeah, at a certain point, I thought, this book will kill me, or I'll kill it. It's going to come down to to one of us. It was just complete. It was a drive to do something. This is the first thing I feel like I've accomplished in the world. The first thing I've done. Teaching it doesn't quite provide that as much as I like it. Writing articles doesn't provide that. But this is something that is done, is out in the world, and it'll always be there. The feeling of actually building something that you can be proud of, I wanted to have that feeling. And so that kept me going.
When someone in 500 years' time comes back to this interview and reads that book, what is one big thing that you would want them to know, which might have been open for interpretation in the book?
Okay, so the one thing that I would very much want them to know is that it is a complex analysis of a complex story. You cannot reduce this book. I don't know that reviewers will. I don't know that people will, but you cannot reduce this book to a simple sentence or to a simple story. I'm not saying it's not one thing and it's not the other. I'm saying it is a much more complex, nuanced, multi-factored story than we have ever realized before. And to put it all together into a single narrative, that's the aim of the book, more so than any one argument.
Don't worry, I'm getting to the end of the short answer questions, but if I was to ask someone in 100 years' time, how would you want to be described and what would you want your legacy to be?
Uh, whew. As a, so at least my professional legacy, very simply, I would want to be known as a teacher and a scholar. That's
And
it.
and personal as well. The whole you.
Um, yeah, and a good person, a good family man, and a good friend to my friends, and yeah, the simple stuff.
So, in terms of next steps, obviously you've put out the book. You're gonna have lots more interviews, much more hype around that. Very exciting. What's next for you, both including the launch of the book and all of the publicity and sharing that and the interviews around that, but also beyond that? Are we going to be seeing another decade-long book? Do you have a next passion project to work on?
I wish I had a different answer for you. I wish I was able to say, yeah, I'm going to write a short little popular book, that that'll make people happy, and some whimsical side project, perhaps like a, you know, romantic novel about the 19th century. Alas, the fact of the matter is this book is the first of 3 volumes in a series on the origins, development, and abolition of American slavery. And so what comes next is volume 2, which is on the 18th century, the British Atlantic world. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to take less than a decade. It's another book coming down the pipeline, very similar to this one.
Exciting. And my final question, and I ask this to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
It's the episode itself. It's the complex, nuanced, but above all, the serious discussion of important issues. Not the this side or that side, not the flippant discussion, not the uninformed, not the ignorant discussion, but the serious discussion of serious issues. That's what I would like, any listener of this to take away, the importance of that, and that it's possible.
I think there's in recent years, and I touched on it before, this idea of cancel culture has gone from this idea of you are to do something so bad that people will never give you a second chance ever again. And I feel like because that issue has got so extreme, it's got to the point that even discussing issues, people will abstain from discussing issues because of the risk that even just being associated with the thing will get them cancelled. And when I had the idea, or a friend of mine introduced me to you, I had that same question with reference to slavery. As a white male in 2025, with my own career ahead of me, and with my own thriving podcast, as you kindly described it before we met, there is that question of would I rather put myself out there and open myself up to discussion and open up myself up to criticism over an idea that could, on the one hand, advance critical thinking and open debate, but on the other hand, could associate me with a thing that could get me cancelled, regardless of what my beliefs are. And I chose the option in which I would open myself up to criticism and critical thinking because I believe that critical thinking and open debate are one of the pillars and most important things in society. And I think that you can't preach that you want to do something if you don't do it yourself. I think this is one of the best podcasts I've been able to do. I feel like I've learned a lot from you. I think your story is fascinating. I'm not surprised that you're getting all of this acclaim and you've been nominated for this prize. I think your book is brilliant. I haven't read it, but I'm sure it is brilliant. Having just, I had to say that. I'm going to read it now. I think that your book is brilliant, and you're brilliant, and I appreciate that you've spent 10 years toward a craft. And I think if anyone does that with such precision, amazing things will come. So thank you so much for coming on my podcast. I've learned a tremendous amount. I'm sure my listeners will too. And go buy the book if you haven't already.
Thank you so much for your time, Harvey. I appreciate it.